In the 19th century, for the few European traders and emissaries who dared to venture deep into the interior of West Africa, the Kingdom of Dahomey was a revelation. It was a formidable military power, a highly organized state with a complex bureaucracy and a disciplined army that dominated the region. Its capital, Dahomey, was a city of sprawling palaces, wide courtyards, and bustling markets. It was, by all accounts, a center of immense power and wealth. But as visitors passed through the city gates, they would quickly realize that this power was built on something other than commerce. It was built on blood and bone. The first sign was the architecture. The palace walls were not merely decorated. They were festooned with the spoils of war. Inlaid in patterns were the skulls of defeated enemy kings and generals. Rows upon rows of human jawbones served as a gruesome frieze. The message was unmistakable. This was a kingdom that did not just defeat its enemies, it consumed them, incorporating their very remains into the fabric of the state. Inside the palace, the macabre displays grew more intense. Thrones rested on mounds of skulls. Intricately carved royal stools were said to be consecrated by being placed upon the severed heads of captives. Drums were decorated with the skulls of rival monarchs, so that every beat was a reminder of a victory. This was not the random savagery of a chaotic tribe. It was a deliberate, highly symbolic, and omnipresent political statement. Every corner of the capital was designed to project an aura of absolute power and ruthless terror. And then there was the army. Dahomey was protected by the Ahosi, an elite, all-female military regiment that the Europeans nicknamed the Dahomey Amazons. They were not a ceremonial guard. They were the hardened frontline troops of the kingdom, renowned for their fanatical bravery and their chilling efficiency in battle. They were legally married to the king, and yet they were celibate warriors, their loyalty sworn not to a husband, but to the throne. Their presence was a constant, living reminder of the king's unique power that could turn women into the most feared soldiers on the continent. For any visitor to Dahomey, the conclusion was inescapable. This was a society built upon a complex and terrifying logic, where conquest was a sacred duty and death was a form of political theater. But the skulls on the walls were merely a static display, the true demonstration of the king's power. The ritual that fed the kingdom's spirit and its economy of death was yet to come. It was a yearly festival, a celebration that would culminate in a torrent of fresh blood. It was known as the annual customs. The skulls on the walls of Dahomey were not mere decoration. They were the final, physical accounting of a complex and brutal system. A system driven by a dual logic, the demands of the gods and the demands of global trade. To understand the river of blood that flowed through Dahomey each year, one must first understand its source, the rise of a warrior kingdom and its complete submission to the transatlantic slave trade. The Kingdom of Dahomey was forged in conquest, beginning as a small inland state in the early 1600s. The Fon people, under a succession of ruthless and brilliant kings, militarized their entire society. Their goal was singular: to fight their way to the coast. The coast was where the European ships waited, laden with the goods that could transform a regional power into an empire: muskets, gunpowder, cannons, textiles, and alcohol. and the Europeans wanted only one commodity in return: human beings. Dahomey became a state entirely dedicated to war for the purpose of capturing slaves. It was the engine of their economy. Each year, during the dry season, the king was obligated to lead his army on massive slave raids against neighboring tribes and kingdoms. These campaigns were not for acquiring territory, they were for harvesting people. The captives were marched back to the capital, where a grim calculation was made. The strongest and most valuable were sold to the European traders at the port of Ouidah, funding the purchase of more guns. This created a terrifying feedback loop. Guns were used to capture slaves, and slaves were sold to acquire more guns. Dahomey became one of the most powerful and feared players in the transatlantic slave trade. But many of the captives were not destined for the slave ships. They were reserved for a higher, more sacred purpose. They were a tribute for the kingdom's powerful and demanding ancestors. The state religion of Dahomey was Vodun, a complex faith with a pantheon of gods and spirits. But the most important and immediate spiritual forces were the royal ancestors. In the Fon worldview, a king did not cease to exist upon death. He merely passed into the spirit world, Natsia, from where he continued to watch over the kingdom, dispense favors, and demand tribute. A living king's power, his very legitimacy, depended on his ability to honor and appease the spirits of his father, his grandfather, and all the kings who came before him. The ancestors had needs. They required servants to attend to them, messengers to carry news of the living world, and warriors to fight their spiritual battles. The annual customs was the mechanism for fulfilling these obligations. The hundreds, sometimes thousands, of victims sacrificed each year were not simply being murdered. In the logic of Dahomey, they were being sent. They were messengers, dispatched with prayers and news for the dead kings. They were new members of the royal court in the afterlife. Their deaths were a necessary act of communication between the world of the living and the world of the dead. This belief manifested in chillingly literal ways. The blood of the victims was considered a potent spiritual substance. It was used to consecrate new temples and to water the graves of the ancestors, a ritual believed to nourish their spirits and reaffirm the sacred pact between the dynasty and its people. The sheer number of victims was also a direct message to the spirit world, a display of the current king's wealth, power, and filial piety. A king who sacrificed generously would be rewarded with fertility, good harvests, and victory in battle. A king who was stingy risked the wrath of his ancestors, which could bring famine, disease, and defeat. This spiritual imperative was perfectly intertwined with a ruthless political logic. The massive, public slaughter was the ultimate demonstration of the king's absolute power. It terrified his own subjects into submission, reminding them that the king held the power of life and death in his hands. It sent a clear message to visiting European traders and ambassadors from rival kingdoms. This was a king who could afford to expend hundreds of human lives simply as a display of wealth. It was psychological warfare on a grand scale, and so the two engines of the kingdom worked in perfect, horrifying harmony. The slave trade provided the bodies. The ancestral religion provided the justification. The captives marched to a bummy were now a currency, ready to be spent in the markets of both this world and the next. The annual customs, or Zwetonyu, as it was known in the Fon language, was the most important event on the Dahomean calendar. It was a weeks-long festival that typically began each autumn, after the harvest was collected and the armies had returned from their seasonal slave raids. The capital, Abumi, would swell with people from every corner of the kingdom, all summoned to pay tribute, to witness the power of their king, and to participate in the nation's most sacred and most terrifying rite. To an outsider, the customs began as a festival of life. It was a time of national renewal. A census was taken. Taxes, in the form of livestock and agricultural goods, were paid to the crown. The king would announce new laws, and loyal subjects would receive promotions and honors. It was a time for the king to display his immense wealth, not just in skulls, but in luxury goods. During a ceremony known as the Sosin, or horse tying, the king would be carried through the city on a magnificent palanquin, tossing thousands of cowrie shells, fine silks, and bottles of rum to the clamoring crowds below. It was a calculated display of royal generosity, reinforcing the king's role as the benevolent father of his people. And woven into this tapestry of celebration were the guests of honor, the victims. In the days and weeks leading up to the climax of the festival, the hundreds of captives destined for sacrifice were treated with a chilling combination of care and contempt. They were housed in special huts, fed well, and given plenty of alcohol. One European visitor described the victims with astonishment, noting they appeared disconcertingly cheerful, drinking and dancing as if they were not prisoners at all. This was not a somber march to the gallows, it was a festival, and they were the unwilling stars. The majority of the victims were prisoners of war, the human tribute from the last raiding season. They were the spoils of conquest, their deaths a direct message to the defeated enemies of Dahomey. Another group consisted of convicted Dahomean criminals, murderers, thieves, and adulterers whose sentences had been deliberately delayed so their executions could be incorporated into the national rite, adding a veneer of state justice to the slaughter. But the most perplexing group were the volunteers, in a testament to the power of the royal cult. Some Dahomean citizens would willingly offer themselves, or even their children, for sacrifice, to be chosen as a personal messenger to the great ancestral kings was considered the highest possible honor, a direct path to an esteemed place in the afterlife. As the festival progressed, the atmosphere grew more charged. The joyous parades became more militaristic. The elite Ahosi warriors would perform ferocious mock battles, their chants and war cries echoing through the city. The victims would be paraded through the capital multiple times, a final tour of the world they were about to leave. They were made to carry offerings, to sing along with the crowds, and to listen to endless speeches extolling the greatness of the king they were about to die for. In the center of the main palace square, a tall, temporary wooden platform was erected. This was the stage for the festival's grand finale. The atto, or platforming, was the moment the crowd had been waiting for. The tension in the city became a palpable force. The feasting, the gift-giving, and the parades were all just a prelude. The spiritual transaction at the heart of the kingdom's existence now had to be paid. The messengers had been chosen, fed, and paraded. The ancestors in the spirit world were waiting. The stage was set, the crowds had gathered, and the king was ready to begin the great slaughter. The air in Dahomey grows thick with anticipation. The feasting and parades have ended. The king, a living god on earth, ascends the great wooden platform erected in the center of the royal square. He is adorned in silks and gold, a figure of absolute power. The celebration is over. The great slaughter is about to begin. The first part of the climax is the Atto ceremony, or the platforming. Dozens of victims, many already heavily intoxicated with rum, are dragged to the stage. Their hands and feet are bound, and they are stuffed headfirst into tall, conical wicker baskets, their legs sticking out from the top. They are living projectiles, human ammunition in the king's theater of terror. The king himself is the primary executioner. In a display of his divine mandate, he addresses the crowd, boasts of his victories, and then personally hurls several of the basketed victims. Off the platform, they fall, tumbling end over end, into the frenzied mob of soldiers and citizens below. Anyone in the crowd is permitted to take part in the killing. The victims who survive the fall are immediately set upon by the mob, bludgeoned and torn apart. It is a terrifying act of communal violence, binding the people to the king's cruelty. After the platforming, the slaughter becomes more organized, more industrial. The remaining victims are arranged in rows before the palace. While numbers varied each year in its most extravagant festivals, the number of victims was said to approach 4,000. The royal executioners, a specialized and honored class of killers, take their positions. This is not a grim, silent affair. It is a performance. An executioner might dance around a victim, working himself into a trance, or give a long speech praising the king before delivering the final blow. There is a sense of competition as executioners are cheered by the crowd for their strength and for a clean, single-stroke decapitation. The king sits on his throne, watching impassively as the heads of his enemies and his subjects roll in the dust. One by one, the messengers are dispatched to the spirit world. But in the logic of Dahomey, nothing is wasted. The bodies, and especially the blood, are a sacred resource. The blood of the sacrificed was considered the most potent of ritual ingredients. It was meticulously collected and mixed with water and clay to create a sacred mortar. This blood mortar was then used to build the walls of new royal palaces and temples. The kingdom was literally being cemented together with the life force of its captives. It was a profound statement. The very foundation of the state was nourished by the blood of those it conquered. The heads of the victims were the ultimate trophies of war and symbols of the king's power. They were taken to be processed. The flesh was boiled away, and the skulls were cleaned, polished, and prepared for display. They would become decorations for the palace walls, pedestals for the king's throne, or even ceremonial drinking cups. Each skull was a permanent, tangible reminder of the king's victory and his power over life and death. The elite Dahomey warriors were not mere spectators. To prove their ultimate loyalty and ferocity, high-ranking female commanders were often given the honor of personally executing the most important enemy captives. This was the final seal on their status. They were not just soldiers, they were priestesses in the state cult of death, their hands consecrated by the same blood that built the kingdom. As the sun sets on Dahomey, the great slaughter ends. The air is thick with the metallic smell of blood. But for the people of Dahomey, this is not a scene of horror. It is a scene of spiritual satisfaction. The ancestors have been honored. The cosmic balance has been restored. The kingdom has been strengthened. Its walls literally rebuilt with the blood of its enemies. The king has proven his power, his piety, and his right to rule. But as the 19th century wore on, the outside world, with its new moralities and its powerful new weapons, was beginning to watch, and it would not tolerate this festival of death for much longer. For centuries, the Kingdom of Dahomey existed as a fortress of tradition, its rituals of blood and bone a shield against the outside world. But the outside world was changing. By the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution in Europe had created a new economic reality. The transatlantic slave trade, the lifeblood of Dahomey's economy, was being aggressively suppressed by Great Britain's Royal Navy. The very foundation of the kingdom was beginning to crack. European powers, particularly the British, began to exert immense diplomatic pressure on Dahomey to end its two core institutions, slave raiding and human sacrifice. But for the kings of Dahomey, this was an impossible request. As King Gezo famously told the British, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source of their glory and their wealth. Their songs celebrate our victories, and I will not be the one to change their way of life." To abandon the customs was to abandon the ancestors, to abandon their entire worldview. It was a clash of civilizations that could not be resolved with words. While the British pressured Dahomey from the sea, another European power was advancing on land. France was rapidly expanding its colonial empire, and its ambitions put it on a direct collision course with the last great independent kingdom in the region. The French saw Dahomey not as a sovereign power, but as a barbaric obstacle to their civilizing mission and a valuable piece of territory. War was inevitable. The conflict erupted in the First Franco-Dahomean War in 1890 and culminated in the Second War from 1892 to 1894. The Dahomean army, led by the ferocious Ahosi, fought with legendary courage. They shocked the French forces with their discipline and their utter fearlessness in the face of modern weaponry. But courage alone could not stop machine guns. It was a brutal, bloody conflict, a clash between two worlds. The Dahomean army, with its muskets and machetes, was ultimately shattered by the industrial killing power of a modern European army. In 1894, French forces captured the capital of Dahomey. The kingdom was broken. King Behanzin, the last independent ruler of Dahomey, was sent into exile. The French colonial administration was established, and one of its very first acts was to issue a decree completely outlawing the annual customs. The great platform was torn down. The public sacrifices were forbidden under penalty of death. The river of blood that had nourished the kingdom and its ancestors for nearly 3 centuries was stopped, not by a change of heart, but by the force of colonial arms. Today, the Kingdom of Dahomey is gone, But its legacy is complex and deeply felt in the modern nation of Benin. The royal palaces of Dahomey are a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site, a testament to the artistic and architectural genius of the Fon people. The Ahosi warriors have become global symbols of female strength and anti-colonial resistance. Celebrated in books and films, the kings of Dahomey are remembered as powerful leaders who built a strong, centralized African state long before European rival. But this heroic legacy exists alongside a darker truth. It is the history of a state built on the profits of selling millions of other Africans into bondage. It is the history of a religion that demanded human blood to appease its ghosts. Modern Benin must now grapple with this dual identity, a history of incredible strength and pride, inextricably linked to a history of systematic brutality. The skulls on the walls of Dahomey no longer serve as a warning to enemies. They are a silent, haunting reminder of a lost world, a powerful kingdom whose sacred traditions were both its greatest strength and the source of its most profound darkness. The story of Dahomey is a powerful reminder that history is rarely simple. Heroes can be villains, and sacred traditions can be brutal. What do you think? How should we remember a kingdom of such profound contradictions? Share your perspective in the comments below. And to continue exploring the complex, uncomfortable truths of the past, make sure you subscribe to the Black Chronicle and activate notifications.